Belarus has today transformed into a much greater threat to Europe than it may appear at first glance. Despite outwardly remaining a formally independent state, the regime of President Alexander Lukashenko is in fact almost entirely dependent on Russia and acts as a loyal satellite of the Kremlin. This dependency developed gradually, but became irreversible after the mass protests in Belarus in 2020 and against the backdrop of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine. As a result, Belarus, which once played the role of a buffer state, has quietly turned into a potential springboard for Moscow's aggressive plans, posing a direct danger both to neighboring countries and to European security as a whole. Alexander Lukashenko has ruled Belarus for over a quarter of a century, maintaining an authoritarian regime and repeatedly falsifying elections. In August 2020, when Lukashenko declared yet another victory in the presidential elections, with a blatantly implausible 80% of the vote, unprecedented peaceful protests erupted across the country. Hundreds of thousands of Belarusians demanded fair elections and the resignation of a dictator who had lost the trust of his people. Instead of dialogue, the authorities responded with exceptionally brutal repression. In the first days after the elections, security forces seized and beat thousands of people. Reports emerged of torture of detainees, while some were killed or went missing. Tens of thousands of citizens ended up in prison, and opposition leaders were either forced into exile or thrown behind bars. This sadistic crackdown on peaceful demonstrations shocked the world, but demonstrated even more clearly that Lukashenko's regime was prepared to cling to power at any cost. The decisive factor that allowed Lukashenko to survive the 2020 crisis was the support of the Kremlin. Russia immediately recognized the falsified election results and promised to help ensure Belarus's security if necessary. Russian President Vladimir Putin publicly announced that he had created a reserve of security forces ready to be deployed to Belarus at Lukashenko's request to help suppress the protests. Although Russian troops did not formally cross the border at that time, the mere statement served as a powerful signal to Belarusian elites and security agencies that the Kremlin would back Lukashenko to the very end. On top of that, Moscow extended a financial lifeline. It granted Minsk a $1.5 billion loan to support the fragile Belarusian economy, which was being cut off from resources by Western sanctions. Lukashenko publicly thanked Putin for this assistance, assuring him that the money was not wasted. Thus, by the end of 2020, the Belarusian ruler was effectively hooked by the Kremlin. His political survival directly depended on Russia's support, as the West had refused to recognize him as a legitimate president and had imposed tough sanctions on his regime. Having lost the trust of his own people and isolated from the West, Lukashenko had no choice but to draw ever closer to Moscow. Gradually, Belarus evolved from being a vassal dependent on Russia economically and politically into becoming its military satellite as well. Since 1999, the Russian and Belarusian regimes have been nominally tied by a so-called union state, which envisaged integration in various spheres. For years, Lukashenko maneuvered to slow down deeper integration in order to preserve at least the appearance of sovereignty. But after the events of 2020, he effectively lost room for maneuver. Russia, exploiting Lukashenko's weakness, accelerated the absorption of Belarus in the defense sphere. Numerous joint military exercises are being held, joint training centers have been established, and Russian officers are present in Belarusian military institutions. The armed forces of the two countries are de facto integrating. A joint military grouping of Russia and Belarus exists, ostensibly to defend the Union state from external threats, by which Moscow primarily means NATO and neighboring democratic countries. This process has put Belarus in a uniquely dangerous position. While formally not renouncing sovereignty, Minsk increasingly allows the Kremlin to dispose of Belarusian territory at its own discretion. This became especially evident in 2022. As Russia prepared for its full-scale aggression against Ukraine, Lukashenko obediently provided all the necessary infrastructure. Under the guise of joint military exercises in January-February 2022, tens of thousands of Russian soldiers with heavy equipment were moved to the Belarusian-Ukrainian border. And early in the morning on February 24th, Russian columns surged south from Belarusian territory, straight across the Ukrainian border to storm Kyiv. Belarus, which only a day earlier had assured that no attack would take place, instantly turned into a co-participant in the largest war in Europe since World War II. Russian troops used Belarus as a staging ground for their offensive against the Ukrainian capital and northern regions. Lukashenko, aware of how this looks, still tries to publicly deny his direct involvement. He puts forward absurd versions of events, claiming, for instance, that Russian troops did not invade from Belarusian territory, but were simply returning from exercises through Ukraine, making a detour via Kyiv. Yet the fact remains, without Belarusian rear support and logistics, Moscow would hardly have dared to attempt the strike on Kyiv. Moreover, Russian military aircraft and helicopters took off from Belarusian airfields to bomb Ukrainian cities. From Belarusian launchers, Iskander missiles and other deadly rockets were fired at Ukrainian territory. In the early stage of the invasion, it was precisely Belarus that provided Russia with the shortest path to Ukraine's capital. And although the Ukrainian army halted the enemy and pushed it back from the north, Belarus's role as an accomplice in the aggression is obvious. It is no coincidence that both Ukraine and Western countries recognized Minsk as complicit in launching the war, as a state that allowed its territory to be used for an attack on a neighbor, thereby violating the fundamental principles of international law. The war events have driven Lukashenko even deeper into dependence on Putin. After 2022, Belarus was hit by a new wave of sanctions and finally lost its ties with Europe and the United States. Lukashenko's regime became a complete outcast in the international community, alongside Putin's own regime. Under these conditions, Minsk sank even further into the Kremlin's embrace, economically, politically, and militarily. The Belarusian economy now survives largely thanks to Russian loans, cheap energy, and access to the Russian market. Any semblance of autonomy and decision-making has vanished. Minsk's strategic steps, such as foreign policy or defense, are fully coordinated with Moscow. Lukashenko, once known for his multi-vector rhetoric, now merely echoes what benefits the Kremlin. He constantly repeats Russian propaganda talking points about the war, blaming the West and Ukraine for provocations, and justifying Russia's actions. In essence, Lukashenko is no longer a subject of global politics, but an object of influence, a puppet tied to the hand of the Kremlin's puppeteer. This has been especially evident in the decision regarding nuclear weapons. Since the 1990s, Belarus, which inherited a significant stockpile of nuclear warheads from the USSR, had given them up and obtained nuclear-free status, enshrined even in the country's constitution. This status guaranteed that no nuclear weapons would be stationed on Belarusian territory and was part of the security assurances for Belarus itself. But in February 2022, alongside the launch of Russia's invasion, Lukashenko swiftly pushed through a constitutional referendum, removing the provisions on neutrality and nuclear-free status. At the time, the step drew little global attention amid the drama of the war, but it was a symbolic move. Minsk opened the door to the return of nuclear arsenals to its soil. And soon after, in March 2023, Vladimir Putin announced that Russia would deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. This was an unprecedented step. For the first time since the collapse of the USSR, Russian nuclear warheads would be stationed outside Russia's own borders. Putin cynically described this as a mirror response to the presence of American tactical nuclear weapons in Europe and to the delivery of conventional depleted uranium rounds to Ukraine. But it is clear that the real aim was to increase pressure and blackmail against the West by turning Belarus into a nuclear staging ground on NATO's doorstep. Lukashenko, despite his ostentatious approval of the move, in reality demonstrated complete powerlessness. The Kremlin has made Belarus its nuclear hostage. Russian nuclear warheads remain under the control of Russian forces, meaning that a part of Belarusian territory is now directly used by Moscow for strategic intimidation of Europe. This is an extremely dangerous precedent. By dragging Belarus into its nuclear game, Putin is radically raising the level of threat to the entire continent, since in the event of escalation or even an accident, a strike could come from an unexpected direction and drag new countries into the conflict. Although Belarus does not openly wage war with its own army against Ukraine or NATO, it already creates real risks for neighboring European states today. First, it serves as a military base for Russia. From Belarusian territory, security challenges are constant. Russian sabotage groups cross over, drones are launched, and Belarusian military airfields and railways are at the disposal of Russian forces. Russia redeploys its troops and equipment near the Polish and Lithuanian borders under the pretext of exercises, creating permanent tension. For example, the annual Joint Strategic Maneuvers (Zapad) traditionally rehearse scenarios of war with NATO, including simulated attacks on Poland or the Baltic states. When the Zapad 2021 drills were held, Russia and Belarus practiced offensive operations, raising alarm among their neighbors. And more recently, in September 2025, immediately after the latest Zapad 2025 exercises, several direct incidents occurred that illustrate just how real these provocations are. Within just 1 week, 2 dangerous situations were recorded. First, more than 20 Russian combat drones, launched most likely from Belarusian territory, entered Polish airspace. Poland's air defenses shot down several, but some drones flew hundreds of kilometers deep into the country, crashing on Polish soil. Fortunately, these drones carried no explosives. They were effectively blanks, leading to the conclusion that Russia was deliberately testing NATO's response. Poland regarded this mass incursion as the most serious approach to armed confrontation with Russia in decades. The Prime Minister even stated that the country was closer to war than at any time since 1939. Soon after, Romania, another NATO member, suffered a similar drone intrusion. Several Russian unmanned aerial vehicles crossed into its territory during strikes on neighboring Ukrainian cities, forcing Bucharest to scramble fighter jets. Moscow cynically denies any border violations, but these incidents speak for themselves. This is a deliberate tactic of creeping provocation. The Kremlin is testing the alliance's endurance, walking the line of direct confrontation. Second, hybrid land-based threats also emanate from Belarus. In 2021, the Lukashenko regime orchestrated an artificial migration crisis on the borders with Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, funneling thousands of migrants from the Middle East toward the EU frontier. This was done to destabilize neighboring democracies and pressure the European Union, a kind of humanitarian attack. Poland and the Baltic states had to urgently reinforce their border protection and declare states of emergency in response to this unconventional aggression. And although the migrants themselves were more of an instrument than a weapon, the incident clearly showed that Lukashenko is willing to act as Putin's accomplice in hybrid warfare against the West. Repeated airspace violations have also occurred. Belarusian military helicopters flying several kilometers deep into Poland, or Russian fighter jets from Kaliningrad entering Lithuanian or Estonian airspace, provoking interceptions. One of the latest incidents came in early September 2025, when 3 Russian MiG-31 fighters from the Kaliningrad region, emerging from neutral waters, violated Estonian airspace and flew 5 to 10 kilometers over Estonian territory for about 4 minutes before being pushed out by NATO aircraft. The intrusion was so brazen that Estonia invoked NATO's Article 4 for emergency consultations regarding the actions of Russia, and by extension Belarus, which had just held joint drills with Moscow, as a direct threat. The NATO Secretary-General called Moscow's behavior dangerous and irresponsible, reminding that the alliance would keep a close watch and defend every inch of its territory. When examining the threat posed by the Russia-Belarus axis, one cannot overlook Kaliningrad, a Russian exclave on the Baltic Sea, wedged between Lithuania and Poland. The Kaliningrad region is heavily militarized. It hosts the Russian Baltic Fleet, deployed Iskander missile systems, powerful air defense assets, and strike aviation. Under normal circumstances, Kaliningrad is separated from allied Belarus by Lithuanian and Polish territory, a narrow strip known as the Suwalki corridor. This roughly 100-kilometer stretch of the Polish-Lithuanian border between Belarus and Kaliningrad is today the only land route connecting the Baltic states with the rest of NATO. Military experts have long described the Suwalki corridor as the most vulnerable point on NATO's eastern flank. If Russia, with Belarus's involvement, were to risk open confrontation with NATO, its first move might be a swift strike from both Kaliningrad and Belarus toward one another, with the aim of seizing this corridor and cutting off the Baltics from Poland. In such a scenario, the 3 Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, would be cut off by land from their allies, which would dramatically complicate their defense and resupply. This scenario has been repeatedly practiced in war games, and although NATO has strengthened its presence in the region, the risk remains. Belarus would play a key role in this hypothetical strike. Without its territory and consent, Russia could not even dream of linking up with Kaliningrad. For this reason, when assessing threats to Europe, analysts now treat Belarus as an integral part of Russia's war machine on the Western Front. In practice, Belarus's armed forces and infrastructure function as a unit of the Russian army deployed on a strategically advantageous Western staging ground. Lukashenko periodically tries to maintain the image of a peace-loving neutral side, occasionally declaring that he does not seek war with Ukraine, that Belarus will only fight if attacked, offering himself as a mediator in negotiations, or even convening showcase forums like the Minsk Conference on security issues. Yet these gestures fool no one. In recent years, Minsk has made it abundantly clear whose side it is on. The Belarusian regime has taken steps so aggressive, from complicity in the invasion to the migration weaponization campaign to the hosting of nuclear weapons, that its statements about peace ring hollow. Moreover, while Lukashenko proclaims non-intervention, he simultaneously allows the Kremlin to integrate the Belarusian army ever more tightly into Russia's war plans. Belarus supplies Russia with ammunition and old Soviet equipment from its stockpiles, repairs Russian military vehicles in its factories, and trains Russian troops on its training grounds. All of this strengthens Moscow's offensive potential.